Welcome to the Commonwealth Matters. I'm Richard Nelson, your host. The last few programs, we've reflected on America's 250th birthday and what sets America apart from every other nation. We've excelled in so many ways, and we've also talked about why people from every race and ethnicity have flocked here to start a new life. And today we're going to continue the conversation about America's founding document, the Declaration of Independence, and we're going to explore how theology intersects with our politics. Joining us to talk further is Lathan Watts, the Vice President of Public Affairs for Alliance Defending Freedom. Lathan is also leading ADF's sister organization, Alliance Defending Freedom Action. Lathan, welcome to the Commonwealth Matters.
Yes, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Hey, we really appreciate your time. Off air, I mentioned to you, I came across your column on National Review that was quite provocative. At least the title was. I'm like, I need to read this and see what this guy has to say. And the title was The Often Overlooked Theology of the Declaration of Independence. And by the way, I think you and CPC and ADF, we're all on the same page when it comes to this kind of thing, God's role in the public arena, the necessity of churches discipling its people to live within the true context of freedom. These are things that make us tick here at CPC. But I couldn't help but to read your column and then to say, we need to have this guy on. So we really are honored to have you here. So this idea that there's theology in the Declaration of Independence, that catches a lot of people by surprise. So if you could, let's start with this. What do you mean by the theology of the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah, so if you look at the Declaration, the part of it that most people still remember from maybe high school civics, even that first sentence or that first paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, government are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. There's a lot packed in just that one sentence. In the column, I described that sentence as the most important one in the history of the English language. And so if you just start with when in the course of human events, that presupposes that there is such a thing as human events, that human beings as image bearers of God with free will in cooperation with the divine providence can have an impact on the events around them and shape the world around them. And that's a uniquely Judeo-Christian view of the relationship between God and man as sort of co-laborers. If you go all the way back to the garden. And that's something that is very different from the Greeks or the Romans. And it gives those of us in America something that the Greeks and the Romans didn't have, which is hope, that we are not, as the Greeks or as the Romans might view it, just pawns in a game played by the gods, or we are not helpless to our fate, which was sort of the Greek view. And so that right there, just in the first few words of that document, there's a lot of theology packed in there. I mean, when you get to that we are endowed by our creator with certain inalienable rights, that places the source of our rights in God, not government. And that means that they are inalienable, means you really can't get rid of them. Like they exist. This is a fundamental, as the document says, a self-evident truth. And so Jefferson and then the committee that, eventually adopted the language, Jefferson said he really, and it was in a letter to Henry Lee, that said, I wasn't really trying to come up with anything new. I was trying to give an accurate expression of the American mind. He was trying to capture, according to him, this is what Americans believe. And those beliefs are shaped by religion and morality. So there's a lot in there. And it is, I think, what makes the Declaration such a, pardon the pun, revolutionary document is that he describes these as the rights of all men, as created as image bearers.
And perhaps this is why people from every nation on the face of the earth have flooded into this country, right? We're a nation of immigrants, and people they're lining up, and they've come over illegally as well because of this foundational idea that we're all created equally, that we're endowed with certain inalienable rights. Maybe I shouldn't be so surprised, Lathan, about your provocative title, which I entirely agree with, that there is a theological underpinning in the Declaration of Independence. But G.K. Chesterton, and you quote him in your column, an English author around the early 1900s, author and journalist, said this, that America is the only nation in the world that is founded upon a creed. That creed is set forth with dogmatic and even theologically lucidity in the Declaration of Independence. So we have a Brit who observed the theological underpinnings of our nation as well. And yet you go on to say, too many of our fellow citizens have forgotten the foundational idea of our republic, which was informed by faith that men must be good to be free. And you link freedom to virtue. Now, this isn't something that we hear today. We don't hear propositions like you're reminding us of. There were previous generations understood this, but why did let's go back to the fathers who crafted the Declaration of Independence. And of course, it was Thomas Jefferson who penned it, and he was guided by John Adams and Ben Franklin. They were kind of his elder statesmen who guided him and tweaked some of the language there. But the founding fathers understood that in order to be free, you had to be a virtuous people, and you can read it in a number of their writings, statements that they made. But why did they believe that? That liberty depended on virtue. To have maximum freedom, you had to be a moral and a virtuous people. Where did that idea come from?
Well, I do think it comes from the Judeo-Christian view of man as fallen, that as a fallen man, mankind who do have free will, that if you are not virtuous, you can use that free will to oppress other people. And so, if you have, it's where our Constitution, which came later, and set up the three branches of government and separated powers and federalism and all of those things that we benefit from. That's all based on sort of biblical anthropology, that because we are imperfect human beings where power is given, it must be checked because the fallen nature of man can use that power to oppress others. So it's the founding era notion of liberty is ordered liberty. Augustine talked about our loves must be properly ordered. Ordered liberty. If you have liberty but no order, you get chaos. Everyone just doing whatever they want. If you have order but no liberty, you have tyranny. And so those two things have to be held, in balance, because human history and the Bible is full of examples that when each does what's right inside of his own eyes, it doesn't work out well.
Oh,
You know,
That,
so
that that was a maxim that was repeated in the book of Judges, and everyone did that which was right in his own
in
eyes.
his own eyes,
Dangerous place to be, right? When everybody becomes a law unto themselves and they don't have moral boundaries, it's really society is not a safe place for anyone when
exactly.
that happens. You go on to say that when that happens, when each man is free to do what is right in his own eye, mankind will inevitably revert to their basest instincts. And I mean, maybe we could look around today and see that we've lost a moral compass that we agree upon in our society. And you see things happening that can only be possible when everybody does that which is right in their own eyes. How do we return to a shared moral compass, if you will? How do we? I mean, we're dealing with, again, things that where young kids are taught that it's okay that your gender, for example, this might be the best example talk about it here from time to time. But if you tell a young person that male and female is malleable, that you can transcend it, and if you really believe as a young boy that you're really a girl trapped in a boy's body, you can transcend that, which I think is one of the most damaging, hurtful, evil things that can be done. And yet this is what's happening in many places in our society. How do we get back to a shared moral compass, if you will? Any suggestions? The big question, we could probably do a whole program on that.
Yeah, that is a big question. I'll try to give you a short answer, maybe. But of the three institutions that are God ordained in Scripture, upon which cultures and civilizations are built, are the family, the church, and the civil government. And had it not been for the fall of man, the civil government really wouldn't have been necessary. Everything was perfect in the garden. But I think those three are all three have to acknowledge a shared common sense of morality, an objective standard, basis of morality, because without one, the only determining factor as to what is, quote, right and wrong or accepted and not accepted is who's in power. And I think that is the reason why, really even in my lifetime, we've seen our elections and our politics, the hyperbole around every election get bigger and bigger and worse and worse. So I think it starts with the family. We have to teach our children these things. Like Reagan said, freedom isn't passed along in the bloodstream. So it starts at home, and certainly there's a role for the church to, Edmund Burke talked about placing moral chains on our appetites, and that truly is the role of religion in a free and civil society. And that's what, our First Amendment protects, is the proper role of religion.
Lathan, I want to press into that if I could, and I agree entirely. But just the point that you made when you quoted Burke, he said that religion places moral chains upon our appetites. Now, today, I think it's a common belief that people think that religion restricts freedom. But Burke isn't saying that. It's putting moral chains on our appetites, which I think if he went on to uh, unpack that, he talks about those things that could hurt us, things that we indulge in that could hurt us. Um, Press into that if you would a little bit
Sure,
and address.
absolutely. So that quote comes from his writing his observations on the revolution in France. He refused to ever call it the French Revolution because he said there was nothing French about it. But, um, and he was, and that's really the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution is the idea of what is liberty. So our concept of ordered liberty, which you could kind of sum up with like, I should be unencumbered to do the things that I ought to do, right? To live a virtuous and moral life versus the French Revolution. And that may be what has sort of seeped into our culture over many years. The French notion of a much more libertine or libertarian idea that you could sum up with, I can do what I want, right? And so, um, yeah, so yes, that quote from Burke is it is is that it is the role of morality to place moral chains upon our appetites, and he goes on to say that the less restraint there is from within, the more there must be from without, and that being the government, right? So, and Reagan said, when government expands, liberty contracts. And so and he's basically, pointing back to what Burke said, that if we're going to be a self-governing nation, that begins with each individual governing themselves and placing restraints upon their fallen nature so that we can live as free men among other free men.
I think one of the ironies in our politics today is you have those on the far left that are advocating that there should be no moral restraints. And that's a broad brushstroke. But when it comes to sexual ethics, pornography, gambling, I don't know, a lot of things that were considered vices, that's considered freedom. But the more people indulge, and this is just a take of what we're saying here and what you're suggesting, the more people indulge in their base desires and pushing against any moral framework or any boundaries in how they should live their lives, the more people do that, ultimately, the more government you need, right? You're going to need a larger safety net. You're going to need more programs to assist those who've developed addictions, those who've made bad choices in their lives, and they're suffering from those choices. And yet, so you have the political left saying, do whatever you want to do. There should be no restraints, say things like separation of church and state or don't oppose your values. And then, of course, they expand programs, right? More programs, more money. We're going to deal with all the brokenness there. And that is a political question. What would be your response to that kind of politics? And that's again, broad brushstroke. Not every Democrat or those on the left may agree with that. But I think that that's a fair summary of where our politics is, at least on the left. Mm. I'll add one more thing, the rise of democratic socialism. I mean, New York just elected the first democratic socialist as mayor, and his lieutenants, if you will, people he endorsed running for Congress, who one of them said that they believe that Western civilization should be eradicated. They were opposed. They wanted to see Western civilization brought down, which is, I don't know. I'm in favor of Western civilization. You and I are benefiting from it right now in this conversation. But
Right.
radical rise in this politics where it's a denouncing of the things that we believe in this country, the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And how do we even begin with this? Is the underpinnings on the far left of no moral restraints, no moral boundaries. And then you see this democratic socialism on the rise, which is essentially a big government, less liberty is where you referenced Reagan. Where do, those who are politically minded and those who want a path and a way to do better in our politics addressing this? Any suggestions? No.
As somebody who's, kind of worked in and around that process for a long time, and I actually served 4 years on my little local city council, I always encourage people to, to be informed voters. You don't have to be a constitutional scholar or an attorney to understand the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. You do need to know enough about your rights to know when they're being violated by your government, and that's what Life Defending Freedom exists to protect those rights, to advance the God-given right to live and speak the truth. But I would say, you need to be an informed voter. And from the local level, don't ignore the local level. All the way up to the federal level to discern, the different worldviews of people who are asking for your vote. Marxism, in my opinion, is the worst idea in human history. And you can look at, I was a history major, kind of a history nerd, and there's the old phrase that those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. I always like to say it's actually those of us who do study history who are doomed to stand around watching everybody else repeat it while we're yelling, pick up a book. Because the 20th century is a bloodbath of 100 million people dead because of Marxism, and it's never worked anywhere in the history of the world. And so anyone who's advocating for it now is really either choosing to ignore history or from a very confident, possibly arrogant perspective, saying, "Well, it's never worked because I've never been in charge of it." And that's a dangerous viewpoint. And to your point about Western civilization, only a perfect God could create men and women, in his image who are perfectly equal in value and dignity and in worth and in their rights. Cultures and civilizations are not created equal because those are created by imperfect human beings. And there is no civilization that can match what Western civilization has done for human flourishing in the history of our world. And I firmly believe it is because of the influence of Christianity in Western civilization. A lot of people look back at the founding era and they talk about these things that I wrote about in the article as sort of principles of the Enlightenment, and sort of Enlightenment era philosophy. And to be sure, a lot of the Enlightenment era philosophers did a lot of writing about this, but they were biblical long before they were part of this Enlightenment philosophy. They're enlightened because they're biblical. And so that seems to be the thing that a lot of folks have missed, in going back and looking at the Declaration as we celebrate our 250th anniversary of.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. I want to go back to something you said earlier about the framework of the Declaration, again, has a Judeo-Christian underpinning, and that we're, the founders believe that we're not mere pawns in a game played by the gods, that we're not helplessly beholden to fate, but the tenets of the Judeo-Christian worldview gave Americans what the Greeks and Romans never had, and that was hope, which I agree with that. Now there are prominent atheists today who would entirely dispute that. They say they're deterministic. They say that there's no free will, right? They would agree with the idea that the Greeks and Romans had this ideology that they didn't really have free will, but it was the gods choosing for them. And I think so for example, neuroscientist Sam Harris argues that free will is an illusion. He contends that our thoughts and intentions emerge from our neurobiology and environmental causes that we don't consciously control. And that means that our choices are ultimately the result of chance or determinism. And here's the question, Lathan. Could that kind of atheism have inspired the founding fathers to forge the Declaration of Independence?
I think the answer is clearly no. What is the point if it's all just a matter of neurons firing in a certain way in everyone's brains? I don't think that you could have a generation like that emerge from a godless society. I mean, if you look at, it was basically the church that sort of created public education, right? I mean, and because they wanted people to be able to read and understand scripture. If you want another generation of people like we had in our founding era, a good start would be educating our kids the way the founders were educated. So yeah, I don't think any of this is an accident, which is basically what you have to accept to look at the world through that atheist lens. You have to accept that nothing became something, and spontaneously, combusted into everything. That's a very interesting nothing you have there.
Yeah. Yeah.
To me, it makes much more sense that there is an omnipotent, omnipresent, benevolent God who set all of this in motion and who created us in his image. And because we're image bearers, we do have free will. And that's where that co-laborer relationship with God. If you look back, when he puts Adam in the garden, this is even before the fall, he put him there to work the garden. And so it was, he gave it to Adam to name the animals. It was a partnership, almost like I say, a co-laborer relationship. He's created this perfect place and sets Adam there, and eventually Eve says, he wants to see what they will do with it. Right. Like that's a we've talked about before. That's a uniquely Judeo-Christian view that I believe the founders, regardless of what their specific denominational beliefs might have been, and even Jefferson's religious beliefs are still kind of puzzled over and argued to this day. But what he put into the Declaration is theologically sound.
Yeah, that's good. I want to get to that in a minute, but we're running out of time. There's one other question I want to squeeze in here is the idea that virtue and morality are necessary for a free Republican government such as ours. And here's a question. So we're seeing a decline in church attendance today, particularly younger generations are not attending like the Gen Xers and the boomers are. Even the decline in the belief of God. Atheism has increased or agnosticism has increased. So are you suggesting that our republic's fate hinges on whether or not Americans remain a religious people? Let's say we turn atheist tomorrow. I mean, is it possible to have this Republican form of government with the purpose of government securing our inalienable rights?
If you look at history, take the long view of history, I would say republics don't have a great track record for longevity. Ours, so far, has sort of been the exception to the general rule, which is where the whole concept of American exceptionalism comes from. It's not, America is exceptional, like that means we're better than everybody else. It's literally like an exception to the general rule of history. So I do think that the role again of religion in a free and civil society is to shape and create men and women who are capable of living in freedom. And so I do think there's a huge role for parents, obviously, and the immediate family, the church, and the community, and all of us to use to take advantage of the blessing that it is to live in a republic where we get some say over who governs us, to advocate and for this idea and to elect people who understand this idea. Just passing a law is not going to make anyone moral, right? I mean, the only people who obey laws are law-abiding citizens, right? But the law in and of itself can be a teacher. It is sort of the collective expression of what we accept and reject. And therefore, law is a reflection of morality in a sense. So I'm an incurable optimist. I am encouraged and hopeful about the future of our country. It's, cynicism is easy. Pessimism is easy. I have, two daughters, 22 and 20, and their generation. I'm seeing amongst them and, their friends in college and young careers, like there is a hunger for meaning. And if we're able to, as parents or as the church, point them and guide them to the true source of meaning, then I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful about the future. But it is not set in stone, that America is always going to be the America that it has been. You know, it's up to us. It's like Ben Franklin said, it's a republic if you can keep it.
Yes. Yeah. Lathan, I love your optimism. I'm agree entirely with you that cynicism is easy and giving up all hope is just that it's easy to do that. Throw up your hands and say, what can we do? But I think if we understood what we have, this great gift of freedom, the framework of government that we have here, that there is meaning in our lives, that there is purpose for us as human beings, and that we live in the freest nation on the face of the earth, that we've got this opportunity to use our talents and use our gifts to pursue whatever God has put before us, whatever God has made us to do. That should inspire us, right? To protect our freedom, to celebrate the good, which we're doing. It's great that we get to celebrate America's 250th birthday, which is great. Just one more question, and we're just about out of time, but I want to press into this. I think one of the ironies in the founding of this country, the crafting of the Declaration of Independence, which I would say is one of the greatest political documents. It's right up there with the U.S. Constitution, maybe in history, right? This amazing political document that captures creational truths, right? That there's a creator who makes us in his image and we're endowed with these certain inalienable rights. It's amazing. And yet, one of the ironies, and I'd be remiss if we didn't have this conversation without addressing this, Thomas Jefferson, who lived in the context of where there was a biblical worldview by and large with his peers, there's other founding fathers, and in the culture at large, there's a biblical worldview. And yet he was not considered an Orthodox Christian. It didn't mean he's an atheist. He did acknowledge God, but he didn't believe in the God of the Bible. He had his own Bible where he really essentially denied the divinity of Christ, cut out the miracles of Jesus out of his Bible, and yet he penned the Declaration of Independence, which brought about these theological ideas into this great political document. How do you reconcile that Jefferson wasn't an Orthodox Christian, and yet we have these great truths that are acknowledged there in a document that he wrote?
Right. Yeah, that's probably an entire other podcast you could do
Sorry, I
right
dropped a
there.
lot of these on you, all these big questions.
Yeah.
We just need to do several more programs.
Without doing like a deep dive in the idea of natural law, which is also referenced in the Declaration, the laws of nature and nature's God, that as image bearers of God, we are, there's an inherent notion of morality and also the gift of reason as an image bearer of God, and that the human mind can reason its way to a moral truth. And I think as an example of that, if you read, Nicomachean Ethics, written 6.5 centuries before Christ, and much of it is compatible with what would come later as Christian teaching. So I think that could be an element of how a guy like Jefferson, is able to do this. And I also take him at his word in his letter to Henry Lee, where he said, I was just trying to give an expression of the American mind. Like, this was so prevalent in the colonies at the time, preached from the pulpits. The list of offenses of King George, the long laundry list in that part of the Declaration, many of those had been topics of sermons and public writings throughout the colonies at the time of the Revolution and the founding era. So whether or not, Jefferson's personal religious beliefs are reflected in that final document, it's still theologically sound as an expression of the American mind at that time.
Yeah. Lathan, thank you so much for that explanation. I think we're going to need to have you on again on the Commonwealth Matters program. Can you do that? We talked about some other topics that Alliance Defending Freedom was involved with, some successes at the Supreme Court level. I think we just need to schedule you to come on another time. You willing to do that?
I'm happy to do it anytime.
All right. Thank you. Lathan Watts with Alliance Defending Freedom. And we were just talking about his column in National Review, The Often Overlooked Theology of the Declaration of Independence. Lathan, thank you again so much for joining us.
Happy to do it. And I look forward to coming back.